All right, welcome everyone. I'll keep admitting people as we begin, but I always like to stick to time. I'm grateful that it's a beautiful day and yet you've joined us inside and some of you are outside to raise awareness and pay attention to social justice issues. This conversation started about a month ago in how are we keeping virtual communities alive, Kirkridge communities connected. So my name is Justine Johnson. I'm the Associate Director at Kirkridge for those who I have not met yet, and welcome and thank you for being here. One of the ways to connect and a long history at Kirkridge is through social justice and movements and activism. So it was very timely for us to have this conversation. We started in a small circle within our own board. I invited board members who will introduce themselves to speak of how they're living into COVID-19. We randomly picked a Monday, to be honest, and thanks to Kathy and Jean, we're like, I think that's Memorial Day, and how wonderful that it aligned to be so when we're talking about honoring those who have done much in the world, but specifically good in the world. How do we continue their messages of being engaged citizens in the United States and beyond? And I think this is also a conversation we need to continuously have about peace and justice. So there will be continued conversations, especially with those with different lived experiences and different identities. I think it's important to note, and I thank our panelists for also contributing to that conversation, about this is a privilege to even have this conversation, to hold spaces like this. So stay tuned, as we only have an hour today and there's hours and hours and hours of conversations we can continue to have about social justice. So if you've just joined, we're going to invite you to mute yourselves so we can truly intentionally listen to our panelists. If you do have questions, we would love to hear them. I invite you to use the chat box and message me directly, Justine Johnson. And at the end, we'll use chat in a different way. But while they're talking, I want our attention to be focused on the speakers. And as a reminder, this is a conversation where we are using I statements and our own lived experiences. So something that might have worked for Marissa or Gillian may not work for you, but this is from them speaking from their own experiences. So to start, because I think we could go for days on this conversation, I would just like our panelists to introduce themselves, talk a little bit about who and where you're at, and if there's anything else you'd like to share, but we will be talking about your social justice work in a little bit. So Gillian, would you like to start? And then Marissa and Rich, you can follow.
Sure. Hello, everybody. It's nice to be in some kind of circle, Kirkridge circle, albeit from a distance and virtually, but it's good to see so many of you again. My name is Gillian Huebner, and I, on the social justice side of things, work on behalf of vulnerable children in the child protection field, mostly internationally, but also here in the US. I'm working with UNICEF on issues related to unaccompanied migrant children in the country. I spent 12 years overseas and worked in the conflict zones of Angola and Sudan in the civil wars as a humanitarian frontline worker, and have since, having children, been on the policy side of social justice work. So I'm back home in the DC area and not on the front lines, but on the policy lines.
Thanks, Gillian. Marissa?
Hi, I'm Marissa. I have been working in the meeting place of theater and social justice, taking theater out of the ivory tower of a space that is traditional and putting it in community. So looking at community stories told by community and for community around issues of either conflict resolution or peace and reconciliation. In more recent years, I just left my job working for the City University of New York, where I was responsible for training 17,000 New York City social workers in undoing racism and trauma-informed care. So since then, I have taken that online, and I'm offering my own training for white folks, particularly about unpacking racism and learning about the legacy of racism and how it's impacting our country even now as we speak, as we see the racial disparities and health outcomes. So doing that, and really interested in looking at how we can heal collectively and do that together in a way that makes community stronger.
Thanks, Marissa. Rich?
Hello, my name is Rich Feldman. I work with the James and Grace Lee Boggs Center in Detroit. And as an introduction, married to Janice Fialka, who introduced me to Kirkridge. So thank you, Janice, who's now there in the name down there at the bottom somewhere on this screen, and to Kirkridge for this opportunity. Essentially, I would just like to share that the two questions that guide me in the political work I've been doing in this last 40, 50 years is, what time is it on the clock of the world? And we don't choose the world in which we live. We only choose how we decide to respond to it. So I'm active in a lot of local political work, community work, as well as international work over the years, and looking forward to this conversation.
Thank you so much. I love the idea that starting close into Kirkridge is just looking at the board and all of the experiences, but also as I look to these faces who have joined us on the call, there is such a wealth of information and lived experience. And I think part of that is where Kirkridge meets you and where you meet Kirkridge on your journey. We hear a lot of what Kirkridge has done for people, and specifically in social justice movements, as a space for those to come together and build community. So we'll dig a little bit deeper into Marissa, Rich, and Gillian's lives and kind of how they've navigated this road during COVID-19. So a little bit about today is I have 3 questions for them. It will guide about half of the conversation. And then I invite everyone into the conversation. Hopefully we'll have some time for what's working for people. How are you sustaining yourself? How are you sustaining your movements? So a little bit of reflection on individual and collective sustainability, I suppose. So the first question we have, and they know these questions ahead of time, is what have you let go of, recognizing your own capacities and need for self-care in the time of COVID-19? And so again, I'll invite the same order, Gillian, Marissa, and then Rich.
Thanks, Justine. I think one of the things that I've been thinking a lot about is that this is the first emergency that I've lived in that I'm not on the front lines as a humanitarian worker, and that's a bit of a strange feeling since that's my training and my practice. So witnessing from behind the scenes, recognizing that I'm not delivering assistance to those most in need has been really humbling and a little bit frustrating too. And figuring out how I can still use my experience, my background to benefit my community has been just an interesting process. And also given the way, you know, our restrictions that we can't just necessarily be out. You know, I mean, when I was working in the front lines in Angola and Sudan, I could have direct contact with those who were most affected. And now I'm not a nurse. And, you know, delivering food to families in need is more complicated because of the transmission. So it's just been really humbling to sort of realize there are real limitations this time. And just also where I am in my life as a mother, you know, concerned about protecting my kids, whereas before I didn't have that same kind of concern when I was on the front lines in Angola and Sudan. So yeah, I guess letting go of an attachment of how much you can do, and accepting the limitations before us. That's what I've been letting go of.
I guess I feel similarly. I think we all probably vacillate between feelings of like, okay, I'm fine, I'm safe, I'm physically, secure right now, and so I feel okay, and then the next moment feeling really emotional and like a lack of surety or control. And I think a big part of my being able to just get out of bed and feel like I can contribute anything to anyone but besides myself is to let go of what I should be doing. I think, as Gillian said, like this idea of attachment, I'm just trying to refocus and reframe instead of what should I be doing, like where am I right now today? How do I take care of myself? And then what can I do? What am I able to do right now? What feels like I can actually approach it? And so that's been about like letting go of being hard on myself. And I in the conversations I've had, it seems like a lot of other folks that I'm speaking with are experiencing something similar of wanting to do or feeling like you should do more, and then how to let go of that and just be present and move from a place of care for self and for community.
Okay, my turn. Part of me wants to say, and I guess I'll say it, I guess my whole life I'm always frustrated and I'm always inspired by the challenges and the frustrations that are within me about how do we matter in relationship to change. So the feelings I have when I get frustrated now aren't much different from the feelings I have when 4 months ago, when I'm doing the political work face to face. So I'd like to say I had better practice doing this, but probably Janice would say not too much better practice in dealing with my own internal frustrations. And I say that because in many ways, a lot of our work has not missed a beat since this has taken place. People from the community who are working on a community land trust are continuing to talk about and plan for the purchase of land and building an eco-village. People in the suburbs who are doing a truth and reconciliation around racism are continuing to do the research and the planning for a campaign that will be more public and off this funny machine at some point. And the center itself is continuing deep political theoretical conversations and study as we always do. And I say that because I don't know why I say it other than when the water shutoffs have continued in Detroit, the pain in Detroit of 40% of the deaths related to the virus in the state are in Detroit. None of this is new. None of this is a surprise. And the folks that are on these discussions, both locally and nationally, are people who are experiencing that and are engaged in it. So the privilege of being on this machine today, to me, is a privilege based on choice, and it's a privilege for the people who are on the front lines also doing this, because this is the political work that they do. And so my self-care is I get to go for walks with Janice every day, and Mike has been here, and we even listen to poetry in the morning. So I guess that's the self-care that folks usually talk about, and I'm eating well. So, but a lot of relationships with people that I hadn't had as much time to talk with and look face to face this way even. So back to you, Justine.
Thanks, Rich. And I think if Gillian or Marissa want to add, you are welcome to that. But I think that's important to note that social justice issues haven't gone away or haven't given a break, right? In fact, COVID-19 has become a catalyst in a lot of ways to say there are indeed cracks, there are major systemic issues and oppression, and now we need to act, especially those who carry privileges. So I suppose that feeds right into the next question. What are you holding on to? What parts of your social justice work have you become deeper involved in or connected more to, or you've focused a lot of your passion on in this time? And so Marissa and Rich and then Gillian.
Thanks. I think it's an Adrienne Maree Brown attribution that self-care is community care. And Adrienne Maree Brown is an activist and author out of the Grease Liebog's Foundation, if you're curious. Rich could tell you more, I'm sure. But that has been a guiding tenet for me recently. And I'm finding that becoming more involved locally and with my neighbors and with my community is hugely benefiting my well-being and my nervous system and my ability to find hope and find solutions that work. So I've always been involved in the Bushwick City Farm, which is a local organization where we squatted some land in 2011 and we've grown food that we give away. It's organic food that we grow and give away for free to the local community, who now in this time are lining up every day. And we have partnered with other local organizations who can provide like hot meals and shelf stable foods. And those of us who are physically able and have the time are going out harvesting, gathering food, and we're giving it away 3 times a week at 2 o'clock. And we've been feeding, and it's just word of mouth. It's just, like a mutual aid organization. It just sprung up naturally from knowing people in the community, knowing my neighbors, and people will line up. And I think this Saturday we fed 150 families. And that's just from people getting together and putting our heads together about how we can share resources. So that has been really like giving me joy and hope. I vehemently believe that we are all we've got, and that is abundance if we can figure out how to mobilize and support one another. So following self-care as community care, another thing that I've learned recently is that to lead in from a like heart-centered, non-judgmental place, because the richness that comes when I can accept that people know what they need and they take what they need and they give what they can. And equity says that looks different for different people. So especially folks who have not had the same access that I've had, right? They're going to need more, and that's how it should be. And this is my opportunity to give a little extra in some ways because I have the capacity and I've had the privilege. And that feels really good to be able to show up in community with folks like that and make sure that we are all getting exactly what we need, however we can give to one another. I've felt a strengthening of community in my neighborhood recently because of that. So that's one just physical, tangible way that that's what I'm holding on to and what I'm trying to grow, because it feels really good.
Thanks, Marissa. I think both points of self-care and community care being linked is wonderful. And I also, your conversation about abundance and equity reminds me of the deep conversation about the stimulus checks and the redistribution of that. So that's what came up in me in that. So thank you for that. Rich?
Thank you. Thank you very much. Holding on to, I don't know if it's holding on or I don't know what you do with it. I think it's the the relationship building, it's the critical connections that have existed and continued to be maintained during this period. It's asking, which I continue to ask, is what do we mean by community? And what do we mean by mutual aid that's intentional versus mutual aid that is supportive? Both are necessary and important to take place, but what makes mutual aid this new word that is intentionally political, that wasn't intentionally political when it was only people just giving to each other before? And so I'm always eager to understand that. For myself, I think one of the phrases that captures my conversations and holding on to is the difference between needs and wants, and that America has the opportunity to learn the difference between needs and wants, because it's been our wants that have destroyed ourselves, our planet, and our communities. Those that are privileged and those that are not privileged. The spirit of wants has destroyed because of the bling-a-ling that we're all part of, and what we think is security, versus our needs, which we are beginning to feel because of these relationships. Holding on to or letting go of, I don't know which one it is, but what it means to be living in a moment of potential nuclear war, a nation that may not have an election in November, and lots of other big picture stuff. And what do we do while we're doing this local community work and this relationship building? What does it mean in the larger picture? So how do you hold both of those, knowing what you can impact immediately and what you cannot? So.
Thanks, Rich. Well, a lot to hold on to. Gillian?
Yeah, those are all great points that resonate a lot. So when this first emerged and we realized we were going to be locking down, closing down, my head went to the stories of from the frontline humanitarian work that I had done, and it was just sort of an interesting reflex, I guess, that my body or my soul or my mind knew that we were heading into an emergency of sorts, and all of the wisdom that I've ever experienced in emergency moments comes from people on the front lines who are, one would say, really suffering, but also more resilient than any other population that I've met. And so the lessons of resilience and the storytelling that I was fortunate enough to witness in those moments has really grounded me. And maybe I'll just give an example, but there was at the end of the Civil War in Angola, the government was using scorched earth tactics, and whole villages were on the run, and for many months, and they were in horrible condition. And a lot of children had been separated from their families as they escaped these violent eruptions. And I was in an internally displaced persons camp, and there was a really old man, the likes of which you don't tend to find in these settings because the war is most cruel to the oldest and the youngest. And he had gathered a bunch of children around him and was telling them a story, and they were full of life, and I hadn't seen anything like that in a long time, because you know, the war is, people sort of get this glazed look, and the life emerging out of these young children was such a stark contrast to the devastation all around that it really, I mean, I think at that moment I could feel every cell in my body realigning. And as it turned out, this old man told stories every night to the children, and he was speaking in the native language, and I didn't speak that. I speak Portuguese, but not Chokwe. And a translator told me what he was saying to the kids, and he was reminding them of their ancestors and where they came from and their sources of strength. And he had the children also telling each other what their individual strengths were that would help get them through. And I thought of that the first night when we went into lockdown and schools closed. And my kids, of course, know this story, but it was the first night that they came into that circle. And so we sat around our table and each member of our family spoke to the other member about the strengths that they would bring through this crisis and how we were going to deal with it. And I just felt this gratitude to the ancestors that are not even from my tribe, right? But we're able to convey that kind of wisdom and security when I was feeling bereft of, of both. Anyway, stories, ancestors, resilience.
Thanks, Gillian. I think in that question, I see a lot of people nodding their heads along with what you are sharing from your lived experiences or the stories you've heard along the way. And this thread that's starting to form about holding community differently or in a different sense of how do we hold on to people more intentionally. And so my final question to you three is, what are you growing into or learning from this? Or how are you finding new ways of doing your work? If it's individual or inner work, if it's external community development or community building work, what are you learning and growing into? And Rich, I think you're first.
First, I really appreciate your last comments, Gillian, about ancestors and what to imagine the uncertainty. So I guess what I'm growing into is the long journey of accepting uncertainty in ways that has been in recent years part of my understanding of thinking and acting, but it becomes more and more substantive and qualitative in the significance of uncertainty and how people before us, and particularly obviously in our own country, so this nation that was put here a couple 400 years ago, whatever. You know, our ancestors who were here as indigenous people and how their ideas are so much, no matter what white thinking and white militarism and racism did towards indigenous people, the ideas and the stories continue. And for African Americans, how the hell do folks imagine freedom when they don't experience freedom? There's always been a question in my mind. Yet folks do that and use that phrase, make a way out of no way. So, and for all immigrants that came at another stage, back in their history, have similar stories and so forth. So to me, it's about the uncertainty and really, really welcoming this moment. So holding on to this moment, what it means in terms of the actual organizing and more of these picture stuff rather than being with people for now, and when that changes and how that changes, we will see. Relationships are continuing and building and the visionary work is continuing. I just think, folks, there's going to be a growing number of us who are going to realize this is an amazing opportunity that we have been waiting for. We keep saying the system doesn't work. And then when it really doesn't work, we say, oh my God, I want the system back. Well, I don't really want it back. And I'm glad it's collapsing. And in any collapsing, there's an amazing amount of pain. And our job is to figure out how to reduce that pain as much as we can while creating something different. And the biggest danger would be go back to anything called normal, because that normal was really what got us here. So I'll just take the uncertainty of where the heck we're going with all this and walk with whoever wants to go with us together, which is all these people around this picture thing we're looking at here. finished?
Absolutely, Rich. Thank you. That's a lot of words I'm holding on to. And I think healing and holding pain are important here in this space. Gillian?
Yeah, what am I learning and growing into? So as a child protection person, my work obviously focuses on children and families as a primary focus. And it's interesting because in the policy work that I do, you know, there's a large focus on making sure families are strengthened and supported so that they can be at their best in terms of caregiving, recognizing that children really develop in the context of a family and a community, and families and communities that have the resources to focus on kids have the best outcomes. And it's interesting because you rarely hear about that focus in the policy world. There's always a focus on education or the focus on healthcare or the focus on X, Y, and Z. Well, all of those things have been stripped away. And so what we are left with is our homes and our family structures and our very closest knit communities. So in a strange sense, this situation has given an opportunity for our work to make more sense, I guess, to the average resident of any country anywhere in the world. Like, we're all 100% dependent on our home structures, family structures, and very close community structures. And this is an opportunity to see how healthy they are or how unsupported they are. So I find that really interesting. And I remember when I first had a newborn, I moved to Sudan from Angola, and I was again distraught because I couldn't do the frontline humanitarian assistance work in the same way. I couldn't go to Darfur with a 3-month-old in my arms. And a Sudanese woman said to me, "Gillian, why are you making this distinction?" She's like, "Humanitarian work and motherhood are the same thing. There's no difference. You know, it's you serving and taking care of those in your company, and that's where it begins in your community. You know, it starts in your home with your child, and then it extends outward." And I feel like that, again, is wisdom from the front lines of the people who've been through the muck and have come out whole. And I take that wisdom very seriously right now. I mean, this is where we are. Our homes and our families and our close communities are our front lines, where we can show up and serve.
Thanks, Gillian. Marissa?
I feel really positively activated right now. Like, I feel this like churning inside of me, which I guess is like excitement about the things that I'm hearing from my co-panelists. I resonate with Rich in that I've been looking to my experience of, or the history that I know of how the Black community has been resilient all of this time in an unjust country that has never respected or prioritized or shown any kind of dignity toward the human rights of the Black and brown communities. And so, you know, I think there's a lot to learn there about joy and about doing work and about believing in change and working toward change, even through real, incredible, unnameable hardship. And so I'm also really like, I'm using this idea, West African idea of Sankofa, of go back and get it. You learn your history to understand the present. And so our American history has had so much of that struggle for certain communities. That's a great place of learning for those of us who are just catching up, because we were not necessarily, you know, didn't have a target on our backs before, and now maybe feeling more like the sense of insecurity or the sense of fear or the sense of danger. to ourselves or to our loved ones. And so I'm using that and this idea that comes from Paulo Freire of praxis, which is the cycle of action, reflection, and action again. Like I'm trying to start by being mindful. You know, I get up in the morning and I do a meditation and I try to center and I calm my nervous system. I have practices to calm my nervous system, or I talk to a therapist. And then I go out and I do something, because also focusing outside of myself, going out into my community and even just observing, taking a walk, or going and like, you know, growing food that I know is going to support a family in need, helps me feel better. It boosts my mood. It makes me feel more engaged and more just better in my own body. And so starting with that action and then having time to reflect on what did that action do, and is it doing what I want it to do? Could I have more efficacy in doing that? And then trying to just constantly cycle around and weaving into and through that the self-care that is required so that I can be resilient and continue to get up and do whatever the work is. And for all of us, it's different. And I love this idea of accepting uncertainty. If we're building a new world right now, which I think we are, because as Rich said, we can't go back to the way things were. It's all falling down because it's showing us what wasn't working before. We have this great opportunity, but there's no blueprint. We don't know how it's going to be forged in the fire of us working together every day, both locally and struggling on a national level. And who knows? But it is full of possibilities. So the more I can continue this cycle of grounding, action, reflection, grounding, action, reflection, it's a way to keep myself really present and okay with the uncertainty of like, this is where I'm at right now. I can't project forward to tomorrow. I don't know what it's going to look like, but this is enough. Yeah, that's all I wanted to say.
That's great, Marissa. Thank you so much. And I hear your excitement and joy out of that. And I think coming together in these spaces is a start or a continuation of that work. And so now we have about 15 to 20 minutes for that engagement. If there were things that came to your mind while you heard one of the panelists speaking, or a follow-up question. I mean, they have such a wealth of experience and knowledge to share. And I also know many of you, and I know all of the experiences and knowledge, or maybe I've only heard of it, but you have it too. So I think this is a great time of engaged learning and conversation as we figure out this new way of being. So I just invite you into conversation. If you prefer to use the chat box, I will speak your question into the space. And if not, you can unmute yourself and ask for the panelists or just a general conversation question.
This is more a thank you to Marissa, because you've suddenly given me an aha moment and an ongoing conversation with a couple of other people I'm trying to work with. And you're saying mindfulness, which is a term that is still sort of a buzzword for me, and I haven't really wrapped my head around that, and tying that to praxis, which I understand with all my work in El Salvador way back when. Suddenly, yeah, okay, I get it better. So thank you.
Thanks for sharing that.
I love this question from Vicky. So technology seems impersonal. Can you speak to ways we might imagine into being a better way of utilizing technology? And I'm adding on spaces like this.
It's funny because I think I've noticed this more in my professional interactions, but having work conversations where people's laundry is in the background, or their dog barks, or their kids come in and, you know, have peanut butter on their face, that to me is not impersonal. That's a view inside some of my colleagues' lives that I've never seen. And so while it is artificial to do this, I just also notice myself like, oh, what does Marissa have on her wall over there? Is that, you know, and it's just, I mean, I feel like there's more of you showing up in a sense, because you're not in, you know, we're not in our professional attire meeting at the office in this neutral space. We're seeing each other in our messy, real lives. So I guess that's my way of dealing with the frustration of that kind of separation and distances.
In terms of the technology question, one of the areas of passion has been what we call new work, new culture. And I think folks are probably very aware of all these 3D printers making masks, right? Not only people hand doing them by sewing, but using 3D printers to do the mechanical sewing and mechanical designs and so forth. So we're at the stage, I believe, that most of what we have and what we need can be produced in our neighborhoods, and that we have the first time in hundreds and hundreds of years to create local economies that are democratically run. And folks might want to check out something called Fab City Movement, which is a global movement committed to, in the next 40 years, because of this technological revolution taking place, which creates permanent unemployment around the world massively, that we ain't seen nothing yet, where folks can actually, will be providing the services and the materials up to 40, 50% of what they need in the city to stop all the global travel and actually the fight between China and the US right now. Again, if we go local and really define community as economics at home.
This is Janice. I apologize. I think I didn't have my mute button on, so one of the things about technology that I'm becoming more aware of is that people, especially with disability or who are sick, or who have not been able to leave their homes for a number of reasons, have really begun to be able to participate in a community. So that is, you know, the silver lining in technology, and people who have not been able to connect in, you know, to various events or conversations can. So that's what I wanted to add. But I also want to, Justine, talk about the 3 questions you asked. They were really very, very insightful and helpful, and and I hope that you will be able to share those even by, you know, the written in the chat room, because I think those are questions that we can ask more people than just those of us on this call. So now I will move.
Thanks, Janice. And thank you for speaking into that about disability needs and issues. I do think technology is a continuous conversation of access and equity, and the power that comes along with access to technology, and how it can connect some people, and some in the US and still beyond don't have access. And yes, I will send the questions. They are definitely guiding questions for us all and to engage in our own reflections. So I will send those along. Thank you. Other questions for panelists or each other?
I think that in some ways we are a shining example of technology, maybe the possibilities of it, because I wouldn't be in this space with many of you if it were not for technology. And it's more than technology. And this leads to my question. What is our role, our, mine, yours, Kirkridge's, our organizations, but also our activist heart in finding ways that, because we are now coming together and we've never been together before, that we can find what I heard so eloquently from you, Rich, and from you, Gillian, and from you, Marissa, that we can't go back to the old ways. We don't want, the worst thing ever would be to so-called go back to normal. So we have this chance to co-create this new normal, but how do we use technology? But beyond technology, how do we use ourselves, our organizations, to bring us together across these different lines, to think together, to dream together?
Sally, what a wonderful question to pose to all of us. And it reminds me of something I should have said at the beginning, that I think for Kirkridge, this is a real turning point in a lot of ways. Kirkridge has pivoted and said, how do we offer programming still as such a physical space center and physical connection? How do we do that? And through over 30 programs, 500 people have connected who maybe could not have access or afford or get to Kirkridge previously. So we, for Kirkridge specifically, we're living into that, and we will continue this into the future, offering virtual programs. Rich, Marissa, Gillian, do you have comments? Anyone who's here in this room?
I'll say that the first thing that came to my mind was when cities began to shut down and I was feeling a little unmoored and didn't really know how to begin with organizing I knew that I wanted to organize, my neighborhood, maybe my block, just to make sure that folks who like maybe couldn't leave their houses and were food insecure could get deliveries, and didn't have a way to do this because I'd never done it before. And another organizer, activist who's actually based in Detroit, reached out and said, if you want to know how to organize locally, I'm going to do an hour info session where I'll just set up some parameters and answer some questions, and then share with you some resources, some Google Docs of some spreadsheets. And it was an hour call, and I learned so much in that hour just about how to make simple systems of organization and how to mobilize people around me. And luckily, I took that and started to do it and realized somebody else had already started doing it. So wonderful. And I could just join forces with other people. And that was really affirming. But how amazing that this one person in Detroit that I'd never met before just offered it up and put it out on social media. I have a skill I can share, and it will only take an hour of your time. And I was like, this is so exciting that we can learn so much from each other if we just are aware of what skills we have, and then we broadcast that we're offering to share them. And I feel like that's a really simple thing that we can be doing, especially if we have the time, that will spread our wealth of knowledge and ability to help each other.
Yeah, I think I've been so impressed with the opportunities too for showing up in new ways. And just like Kirkridge has rerouted, and I'm so pleased to see how quickly you've done that and how with so much energy and made it so available to so many more people. In the same way, our PTAs have done that. My kids go to one of the largest school systems in the country, which is very diverse. We have extremely high poverty rates and also a lot of wealth. And it was just so interesting to see, PTA meetings go online, whereas, if they meet in person, you sometimes have 5 people show up. But online, in the middle of a crisis, you had 150 people show up. And in those brainstorming moments, where the first concern is, my God, we have all these kids who rely on food in our school system, and how do we close that gap, and the schools were providing meals every day where people could come and get them. But as people became sick, they couldn't, leave and pick up food every day. So the PTAs organized grocery card drives, and we raised, this was sort of happily timed with the stimulus checks, but throughout the county, we raised, I think, $50,000 to give our families in need, grocery gift cards so that they could, and then, if they were sick, we would organize grocery pickups and then help deliver them. And that's the kind of showing up that, that potential is always there, and it just never got tapped into. And yet it was a basic human instinct to take care of our own, the kids in our schools and their families. So that kind of natural organization, it's just sort of, that's what you see in refugee camps. And when push comes to shove, it's great to see people finding that creativity and that new way of doing things. So.
I'd like to comment a little bit about, the ways that Kirkridge has pivoted. And one of the things that I think we've learned, and, so much of it was like, as a friend of ours would say, it's hidden in plain view, which was the number of people who no longer physically could access Kirkridge, maybe because of age or maybe geographic distance, and or the barriers of finance was a barrier that Kirkridge always struggled with. But the other barrier that Kirkridge struggled with was generational divides. And that has shifted as well. And Justine's going to be embarrassed, but the fact that Justine was willing to come to Kirkridge in her 30s and say, this is a place I want to invest in. Her energy and the energy of younger people like her, Marissa, you're another person. You decided that it'd be okay for you to come on the board as really the youngest person on the Kirkridge board. The energy of Justine and Marissa has really changed the dynamic of what's happened at Kirkridge. And, and Gillian, you're right in the middle of having children. Most of the people on the board don't have children that are living at home with them anymore. Those shifts have really made a dynamic difference in what's happened at Kirkridge in this moment. There would be no way without know-how and knowledge and the energy that Justine brings to us that we would be able to make this shift so well. And I have been just amazed at the number of people who are paying attention to Kirkridge but have never shown up at Kirkridge that are showing up in these meetings because for some reason one of those barriers is now down. And so I just want to say that I'm incredibly grateful and also honor the work that's being done by Justine and others behind the scene. And Gillian, thank you, and Marissa, thank you, and Rich Feldman, thank you. It's just lovely to be on this conversation this afternoon with all of you. And, like one of you said, I think Marissa, you said, I'm actually kind of excited. I kind of don't feel the heaviness right now. And I feel kind of embarrassed to say that after spending time with the New York Times piece yesterday. But there is a heaviness about where we were that hopefully, Rich, we won't return to what's normal.
Thank you, Jean. That is very nice, and I am accepting your compliment. That's a part of my processing. And I think we have time for one more question.
I have an idea that I wanted to share. I've been following the Circles of Trust, and now this hour here. And I used to go to Kirkridge years ago and didn't realize until I started tuning in again how much I miss you all. But I'm hoping that maybe you can even do retreats, a retreat that we can be at home, and we can still have a retreat leader and still have those kind of circles. And I'm hoping that you consider something like that as you plan for the future.
Thanks, Arlene. Absolutely. I think we are looking at endless possibilities and opportunities as we look to the future. And then I think I see one more question, and we'll end with this. What potential do you see for change in our political philosophy from one of security to one of generosity? We'll have a second session on that entire question, I think. I love that question. So if there are brief comments on it. Thank you, Vicki.
There's a group of people, thinkers out of called The New Story that are there. I think they're in Austin, Texas now, and they are doing a lot of thinking about how to move into a new story away from stories of dominance and the stories that we've told over generations to a new story of generosity. So they're worth checking out. It's thenewstory.com.
One resource that comes to mind for me is there are these anti-racist transformative values that are developed from several different thinkers' work, but I've compiled them into a document that I'd be happy to share with Justine, who maybe could email it out. And it's about moving away from a racist model, which is inherently patriarchal and capitalist, and moving into an alternative model, which is all the opposite of all of those things. So where, for example, capitalism says, you know, there is one way, and so we're going to do it this way, and there's not any kind of dialogue. The transformative model would be that a dialogical one where there is no hierarchy. So there are these ways of moving from scarcity to abundance, from fear to generosity, right? And they're very clear, like, here's the model that has been, here's how you reject that model and transform it. And the list is really long and we don't have time to go over it, but I'm happy to share that as a resource just to continue this thinking about how do we want to transform? What would it look like? How do I organize my thinking around what other possibilities there are?
That'd be great, Marissa. Yep.
Just a quick, I think it's valuable at this moment to watch the Poor People's Campaign gathering in the end of June. Even though there's a generational issue, they have not gotten too young in terms of who they're reaching, but they are raised, maybe that will change in this moment. But they are raising the moral revolution. And if we talk about really transforming the general narrative, the spiritual revolution, the moral revolution is critical to the material conversation that we more easily talk about. And the courage, which is what I think Kirkridge does, is the courage to put both of those together, the spiritual and the moral, in ways that are part of the activism. So I just want to thank everybody here, the panelists and Justine, for making this happen. So thank you.
Thanks, Rich. So a couple comments as we conclude. I think this space is ongoing and continuous. This work is continuous. In this conversation, I had tapped 3 board members' shoulders, and Janice kind of moved aside and said, I think Rich would be wonderful. So I'm so glad to hear from all 3 of you. And I know that we need to continue this conversation and invite more identities in, more conversations and lived experience. So I encourage everyone to stay tuned. We'll have another conversation about this hopefully in June. If you haven't been to another Kirkridge program, I invite you in to look at kirkridge.org, where we have a running list of virtual programs. We try and offer about 2 a week. So we have been quite full, even though our physical doors are shut. And I did try and write down all of the resources mentioned by our panelists and our participants. So I will send that along. I will send a link to this recording along with those resources. And if I receive other handouts or links, and I invite anyone to send me that. This is a continuous growing and learning process. So if you didn't get to speak your piece or wanted to share a resource, please send it to me and I will send it out. And hopefully we'll see each other again virtually or in person at some point soon. Thank you all for being with us. Thank you, Gillian. Thank you, Marissa. Thank you, Rich. Thank you, everyone, for being with us this afternoon. Be well.
Thank you all.